All right, so this is going to be our video for Axial Skeleton Lab. Now I want to show you a little bit about some of the resources that we have for you guys to look at. So don't forget to look up here for our lab number 7, the PDF from the lab manual. So this has a list. This is going to be a really important list. So make sure you look at this of all the bones you need to know and all the processes you need to know. In your book, they identify a lot more things than you're going to need. So make sure that you go through like with a highlighter and highlight the things that you need to memorize, and so you know which ones to prioritize, which ones I'll be testing you guys on. So this is the list of things. It'll be really important for the next lab quiz. The other thing is that we've got lots of really good labeling activities and lots of good pictures for you guys to go through here. And then this, there's a lot of good practice questions over here too. Other things we have, so a couple of ed puzzles. This is a video that you can actually find in APR. So APR is a really great resource. I would definitely use it for this lab. A nice thing is that down here, I've actually got a lot of pictures from APR on your little flashcards. And so these are pictures that have been taken from APR that you can see, different parts of the skull, different areas here. So the nice thing is that in APR it will highlight the different landmarks. So you don't just need to know the bones, but you also need to know sort of different areas on the bone. So there's not all from APR, some of them are pictures too. Not all of the foramen or openings in the skull, but some of them. As you can see, it's different areas you'll need to know. So the flashcards will be useful for this. There's a lot of them, and some of them are duplicated, but I figured you guys can use a little bit of extra practice. There have been some really good videos for all the different bones. Unfortunately, you guys don't have them to touch and feel, but you guys make sure you look at all of these videos here. So it's a long playlist. But a lot of the videos are pretty short. They're going to go over one specific model and point out, like, on the model, here's this process, and here's this process. So make sure you look at those. Other things that we've got are these biodigital human widgets are pretty cool. They are going to be sort of 3D. You can look at them on your computer. It's, you know, close-ish to having the model in front of you. But you can see here different areas of the skull. You can kind of move it around. You can look at it. They're labeled. If you click on it, you can kind of see this is the mental foramen. So that's going to be the little hole in the mandible. So it's really neat. You can zoom in, zoom out. You can kind of look at the different areas of the bone, move it all around. And there's quite a few of these widgets for you guys to look at. You can see the rib cage widget, atlas and axis. So I do like these as a good kind of substitute for the having the model. So if you can't have the model in front of you, at least you can kind of move these widgets around. So they're pretty cool, and they can be helpful to look at. You can zoom in and look at them from all different angles, from the outside, from the inside, and so on. And the nice thing, they're also labeled, so you've got those. Let's see. You've got a couple others in there. Then we've got, so the publisher McGraw-Hill has got a couple of online labeling practices. These use Flash, so it's not going to be supported for very much longer. But I guess while it is, you guys can practice. It will stick if it's right, and if it's wrong, it won't stick. Now, once again, this is another area where you have to look at your lab manual, because most of these you need to know on this one, but there are some where, like the base of the skull, especially, there's a lot of things you don't need to know the stylomastoid foramen or the superior nuchal line. So just make sure you look and see which ones you need to know before practicing all of these. They're not specific for what we'll be asking you. And then get Body Smart, the skeletal system. This is really cool. There's also muscular system, nervous system, circulatory system. This is the first one that we've, we're moving into the skeletal system now. So, but you can go through, it has little tutorials about all the different parts of the skeletal system. And so you can look at the overview about the skeletal system, learn about it, look at all the different pieces, read about it. And it's sort of a self-paced tutorial that you guys can use. And it has a lot of cool features. So look, that's a good thing that you can use. So the other thing is obviously go into APR and use all of your, look at the cadaver dissection. You can look at all the individual bones. You can see a lot from APR. So I definitely recommend using APR. So as I said, these are some of the pictures from APR. There's also some good videos in APR, like the skull video here is in APR. And don't forget to look at the pictures in your lab manual and make sure that you can label those. So I'm going to go ahead and start going through the information for lab. Now, chapter 8 is a very lab heavy chapter. So this is going to be talking about what the bones are, you know, what they're made of, the structure of the bones, and identifying the bones, and looking at all the different features on the bones. So for chapter 8, we're going to focus on it in lab. So I'm not going to lecture about chapter 8. In lecture, there's not as much physiology. It's mostly anatomy in chapter 8. So we're going to focus on that in lab. So we'll do the axial skeleton this lab, and the next lab we'll do the appendicular skeleton. So what is the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton? So the skeletal system is organized into 2 divisions. And the axial skeleton, remember axial is going to be the axis of the body. It's composed of the bones along the central body axis. So the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage or your rib cage. So your skull, vertebrae, and rib cage. It seems like that wouldn't be very much, but this is actually really complicated and confusing. So we'll start with this. Next lab, we're going to learn about the appendicular skeleton. And those are the bones that make up the appendages, right? So your arms and legs. It also includes the parts of the appendages that attach the body to your axial skeleton. So your pectoral girdle, which is up here, holds the upper limbs in place, and your pelvic girdle, which is down, and holds the lower limbs in place. This in your book is a really good. Everything in blue is axial skeleton. Everything in sort of this tannish color is appendicular skeleton. And it goes through and it tells you how many bones are in each section and you know how many of them there are. So like you have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and so on. You have 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones, and then it tells you how many of each type. So this is really good right here. Make sure you know how many bones and which type. So this is nice. We'll learn about the blue ones today, and we'll learn about this sort of brownish ones next time. Now, before we move further, I want to mention that, as I said before, you're not just going to be memorizing the name of every bone. I also want you to memorize the markings. And so a bone marking is just like some sort of landmark or some sort of special feature of the bone. Now, the namings of these markings have meaning, and if you know a little bit about what the names are, it'll help you figure out, you know, either what the marking looks like or where it might be located. So if you have something that's located on an articulating surface, so an articulating surface means like part of a joint. It's where one bone meets another bone. So usually things on articulating surfaces or near joints are going to be named condyles, facets, heads, or trochleas. So if you hear any of those, if you're looking for the medial condyle or the lateral condyle or the articular facet, it means it's near a joint. And things that are depressions in the bone, so like a divot in the bone, might be called an alveolus, a fossa, or a sulcus. Things that are projections, so things that are bumps that come out of the bone, usually they might be for tendons or ligaments to attach to. It can be called a bunch of different things depending on their shape and kind of where they're located, but some of them would be like a crest, an epicondyle. So epicondyle is like usually like near the condyle, but like on top of the condyle or next to a condyle. A line, a process, a ramus, a spine, a trochanter, a tubercle, or a tuberosity. Lots of different ones for projections. And then finally, openings or spaces. So a canal is a passageway through a bone. A fissure is a narrow slit-like opening. A foramen. Foramen is important. We'll learn about a couple of those. These are rounded passageways through a bone. A lot of times, like blood vessels and nerves might go through them. A meatus is also a passageway through a bone, like an external auditory meatus going into the ear. And a sinus is a cavity or hollow space in a bone. So we'll be learning about a lot of these different ones. So it's good to know a little bit about what the words mean. So in the slides that follow, I am not going to read the slides to you for all of these because that would get really boring really fast. You guys are going to have to go through and use these slides to help you label your lab manual, and then once you've done that, you can use that to help you in the quiz. So looking through these, I'll go through some of the high points, but I'm not really going to sort of read all the read everything on each slide. You guys have the slides, you can look at that and use those to help you label your lab manual. So we're going to start with the skull because this can be pretty complicated. It's one of the most complex structures in the skeleton, and learning the skull, just learning all the bones in the skull is very complicated. And then we also have a few markings for you guys to know. Thankfully, you don't need to know all the foramina in the skull because that would take a long time. And you may need to learn it depending on where you're going later in your career. But for now, we only have a few markings to know. So it's composed of 8 cranial bones. They're going to make up the cranial cavity, which is the part that actually touches the brain, and 14 facial bones. And many of these are paired. And the facial bones are going to create like the face and the mouth area. So mainly the bones here that are in bold are the ones to know. But also the mental foramen. So once again, as I said, it will be important to go through, especially if you have a paper copy of the book or even if you have your ebook, and highlight the ones that you guys are going to be required to answer and to identify in class. And that will help you focus in and hone in on what you need to study. So make sure you memorize all the different bones. So you definitely need to know all the bones, but you'll only need to know some of the markings. So this is the anterior view of the skull. You can't see very many sutures here. Sutures are going to be the area that connects 2 bones on the skull. So it's like a joint between 2 skull bones. So you're going to need to know 4 of those sutures, and I'll get to a couple of them soon. There are a lot of different sutures. Thankfully, you don't need to know all of them. So the next is the superior view. And so the superior view is kind of the top here, and it shows some of the sutures we'll talk about. The frontal bone, the 2 parietal bones, and the occipital bone are the main ones here. And then we can see the coronal suture, which is going to connect the frontal bones to the paired parietal bones, as well as the sagittal suture, which connects the right and left parietal bones together. So these are 2 of the main sutures to know. And then finally here, in this back part, the lambdoid suture is going to be connecting the parietal bone and the occipital bone. And we can see the lambdoid suture even better here from the posterior view of the skull. The lateral view of the skull shows us a couple of things you guys need to know, the zygomatic arch and the temporomandibular joint. And so this part right here is going to be the zygomatic arch, and it's made of the temporal process of the zygomatic bone as well as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So kind of together it makes up your cheekbone. So that's your zygomatic arch coming to the back. So you guys are responsible for knowing the zygomatic arch as well as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and then the zygomatic bone in general. And then we can also see this external acoustic or external auditory meatus, which is going to be the opening into your ear canal, or that goes into your inner ear. Now, you'll also actually need to know the sagittals. So instead of just looking on the outside, and you do have to look at all the different areas in the outside of the skull, I also want you to look at this sagittal view of the skull. So if we cut the view the skull in half, some cool things we can see are going to be the frontal sinus. You'll need to know the sinuses, as well as the sphenoid sinus in here within the sphenoid bone. We can also see the palate here, so the hard palate. And the hard palate is made up of the palatine process of the maxilla, as well as the palatine bone, which is this green bone back here. Now you do have a couple of other sinuses, the ethmoid sinuses as well as the maxillary sinuses, but the maxillary sinuses are kind of too lateral and we can't see them on this midline view. You'll also have to look at the skull upside down. This is the inferior view of the skull, and we can see the hard palate pretty well here too. So this is going to be the palatine process of the maxilla and the palatine bone. They're going to make up the hard palate. And you do need to know the incisive foramen also. This big part right here is the foramen magnum. So remember foramen, that means the rounded opening in the bone. And foramen magnum means like a big, magnum is giant. So it's the largest opening. And this is where your spinal cord is and your brainstem are going to go and connect up to your brain. It's a pretty important one. Your occipital condyles are going to be over here. And this is going to be where your skull is going to articulate with your vertebrae. Now we can look through here. And if we like chopped the top of your head off and looked down inside, took the brain out and looked down inside your skull, this is the internal view of the base of the cranium. There are some important things to note here. This is one of the only ways you can see the ethmoid bone, at least from the inside. It's one of these cranial bones, and it has the crista galli and the cribriform plate. You'll need to know those, and we'll talk about them again. This is your olfactory bulbs actually sit right here, and your olfactory nerves go right through those cribriform foramina into your nose. So it's kind of important. We'll talk about it again in chapter 16. Now right here, this is going to be your sphenoid bone. It looks a little like a butterfly, and there's this little depression. It looks a little bit like a Turkish saddle. It's called the sella turcica, and this is where your pituitary gland sits. And we said the pituitary gland is part of the brain, or it's a little gland sticking off the brain that's really important in the endocrine system. So make sure you know those internal bones of the skull, the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, the inferior nasal concha, the vomer, and the palatine bone. You cannot see them very well on the outsides of the models, but you can see them on the insides of the models. And that video that I linked that shows the exploded skull, it kind of explodes them out and shows you the internal bones too. So don't forget about those. So as I said, you'll have to know the sutures. These are immovable joints between your cranial bones, and there's 4 of them you'll need to know. There are a lot more of them, but the 4 main ones you'll need to know are the coronal suture, which is the one that I mentioned before. It's in between the frontal and parietal bones. The sagittal suture, which goes along the sagittal plane, and it's in between the 2 parietal bones. The lambdoid suture, which is going to be in between the occipital bone and the parietal bones. And now within the lambdoid suture, you can have these things called wormian or sutural bones, which I'll talk about in just a second. And you can see them all the way back here, these little green Ys. These guys are wormian bones or sutural bones. And so this is where we have a separate center of ossification, which kind of made its own new bone within the suture. And it doesn't have its own name. We just call these sutural bones. They're bones that formed within usually the lambdoid suture. And then finally we have, and you can see this from the lateral view, the squamous suture. So the squamous suture is going to be in between the parietal bone and the temporal bones. So this is going to be the last suture to know. So you can see up here is the coronal suture, then we have the squamous suture, and this is the lambdoid suture with one of those sutural bones. So those are the 4 main sutures to know. Make sure you know what they attach and be able to identify them. Now the orbit, you can see that there are a lot of different bones that make up the orbit, and knowing which bones make up the orbit will be good. There's a couple questions about that in your lab manual. Now as we go through some of the different things inside, I want you guys to know the paranasal sinuses. We will talk about them again in the respiratory system, but it's good to start learning them now. These are air-filled chambers within the bone, so they actually make the bones in your head a little bit lighter. They're lined with mucous membranes. They humidify and warm the air that you inhale. It also provides resonance for your voice. So your ethmoid, your frontal bones, your maxillary bones, and your sphenoid bones all have sutures in them. And if we look at the sagittal section, you can see your frontal and your sphenoid sinuses. And if we look through here, this is kind of a drawing of what it would be. We can see the maxillary sinuses are off to the side, so you can't really see them on that central area. And then back here is up here is going to be those ethmoid sinuses, and they're a little bit smaller and not as easy to see as the big frontal and sphenoid sinuses. And if you've ever felt sinus pressure, you've probably felt where those sinuses are located. Now, there are 3 tiny little inner ear bones inside your ears, inside your temporal bone. 3 on each side, so 6 total that we will learn about in chapter 16. So they're malleus and the incus and the stapes. So Of your 206 bones, we'll save these 6 bones until chapter 16. We'll learn about the other 200 in this lab and the next lab. All right, now moving on from the skull, we're going to move down and talk about the hyoid bone. So our hyoid bone is going to be suspending our larynx up, and it's the only bone that does not articulate with any other bone. So that's a good one to know. It's like a nice, FYI. This could be a good question to answer. It's like a trivia. The hyoid bone does not articulate with any other bone. All you need to do is be able to identify the hyoid bone. You don't need to know any other pieces of it. So it sits right here on top of the larynx. When we go to the respiratory system in 169, we'll look at the larynx and you'll identify it again. Now, the skull is going to be a little bit different, and it's shaped a little bit differently in infants than it is from adults, and as you grow, it's going to change. And infants' cranial bones are not going to be large enough to surround the brain completely, and they're also not it's not all bone. They have a lot of areas in between the bones that are going to be not fully developed yet, the soft spots on the baby's skull. This is going to allow the baby's skull to be a little bit more malleable and to pass through the birth canal. And so we call these fontanelles, and they're the cranial bones are connected by dense regular connective tissue. So we've got the hard ossified bone, and then we have the areas of dense regular connective tissue in between them. As we said, this is going to be the soft spot on the baby's skull. It eases the passage through the birth canal. So there are 4 that you guys have to identify. The small mastoid and sphenoid fontanelles are going to close pretty quickly after birth, so you won't really notice those as much. There's a posterior fontanelle, so in the back here, that closes around 9 months, and then the big one, the anterior fontanelle, that's the one that you can really see on the baby's head. And I remember that when my kids were really little, when they screamed, you could see it like vibrating in the newborn. You can kind of see it pulsing up and down sometimes. And that closes around 15 months. And so here we can see this is the big anterior fontanelle, the posterior fontanelle is in the back, then we've got the sphenoidal fontanelle and the mastoid fontanelle. And so make sure you can identify those. So now we're going to move down from the skull and the hyoid bone, we're going to move down to the vertebral column. And so we have 24 individual vertebrae, and then the fused sacrum and then the coccyx, which are made up of fused vertebrae. There are 5 divisions in the vertebral column, and they are identified by a capital letter for the region followed by a numerical subscript. And that's going to indicate the sequence from superior to inferior locations. It's a little complicated, but this picture really helps. So if you look through, we have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae. So these are the first 3. Now we have the sacrum, which is 5 fused vertebrae, and the coccyx, which is 3 to 5, usually around 4 fused vertebrae. So one of our previous students told me that they remember it by remembering at least the first 3, by remembering breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So you have breakfast at 7, and then you eat lunch at 12, and then you have dinner at 5. So 7, 12, and 5. So I like that. I think it's all the mnemonics are good. So the cervical vertebrae, they form the neck bones. There are 7 vertebrae, and they are C1 through C7. C1 articulates with the occipital condyles of the skull. Next, we have the thoracic vertebrae. They are each going to articulate with one of your ribs. And so that's really, well, 2 of your ribs, 1 on each side. That's really important. There are 12 of them, T1 through T12. Now, the lumbar vertebrae, these are the widest vertebrae. They're the weight-bearing vertebrae. They bear the most weight in the body. They kind of form the small of your back, and they're L1 through L5. Now the sacrum is formed from 5 fused vertebrae, S1 through S5. They're fused into a single structure by the late 20s, and they're going to articulate with the hip bones, so they make up part of the pelvis in the sacroiliac joint. And then finally, your coccyx, or your tailbone, are 4 fused little tiny coccygeal vertebrae, and they start uniting during puberty. We've also got these special curves in our spine. And so we have the cervical curvature at the top with your cervical vertebrae. Your thoracic vertebrae have a thoracic curvature. Your lumbar vertebrae have a lumbar curvature. And then your sacrum has a sacral curvature. So there's not much. Your coccyx is so small it doesn't have much of a curvature. And so these give the spinal column flexibility. They also support the weight of the body, and these curves are very important for the fact that we actually stand upright. And they're going to appear sequentially during fetal, newborn, and child development stages. So the primary curves are present at birth, so they're going to start like in the fetus, and that's going to be the thoracic and the sacral curves. And so they're going to result in that C-shaped column. So our thoracic curve here and our sacral curve are going to sort of curve us into that fetal position. So if you think of that fetal position there. And so when the newborn comes out, they're curved in that sort of C-shaped because of those two primary curves. The secondary curves are going to appear after birth. And so the cervical curve is the first one. This is your first, so instead of just sitting like this, the infant eventually is able to hold their head up. And so we have that cervical curve that forms between 3 and 4 months. And then the lumbar curve, so that's the curve at the small of your back, is going to appear when the child is learning to stand and walk, so usually by around the first year of life. So those are the secondary curves. Now, this is often talked about too. There are some abnormal spinal curvature abnormalities. So kyphosis is an exaggerated thoracic curvature, and so it kind of produces a hunchback look, which may be associated with osteoporosis in older individuals. Lordosis is an exaggerated curve of the lumbar, or like sway back. It can be resulting from added abdominal weight, and often happens during pregnancy, right, when you have like a giant fetus. And so it gives you kind of a sway back kind of look. And then all of that's... those are exaggerations of the normal curves, whereas scoliosis is an abnormal lateral curvature. So normally, your spine should be pretty straight up and down, but a lateral curvature will have like, it curves out in one direction. So this next thing we'll talk a little bit about is vertebral anatomy. Your vertebrae are pretty complicated. They're going to be these irregular bones, so they have lots of points and irregular different shapes, as well as they have to have a hole in them for our spinal cord to go through. So they protect the spinal cord. So you can read all of that as we go, but I'm going to basically show you the picture. So this is a thoracic vertebrae, but it's like a typical vertebrae. So things that you'll need to know, all of these different processes of the vertebrae. This is the body. This is going to be, we have intervertebral discs would sit here. We'd have another vertebrae sitting on top of that. This is going to be the vertebral foramen. This is where our spinal cord would run. So it protects the spinal cord. And then we have our processes. The spinous processes in the back. So if you bend your back and feel along your back, you can feel your spinous processes. The transverse processes come out laterally to the sides. And then the vertebral arch, so how it arches around this vertebral foramen, is going to be formed by the lamina and the pedicle. So the pedicle is going to connect the transverse process to the body, and the lamina is going to connect the transverse process to the spinous process, and together they make up the vertebral arch. Other things are going to be the facets. So the superior articular facet, and then on the inferior surface you can see the inferior articular facet. These are going to be areas where the vertebrae are going to articulate with each other. So make sure that you can label these things. And we can see here that our articular facets would be here. So we can see that our superior articular facet of one vertebrae is going to articulate with the inferior articular facet of the vertebrae above it. So we can see that a little bit. Now, if we looked here, this is the vertebral foramen where the spinal cord goes, but if we look from the side, the intervertebral foramen, this is going to be where some of our nerves are going to come out, and so it's just a little bit of an opening between the different vertebrae. And as you can see, the vertebral discs, intervertebral discs, are going to sit in between the body of each of these vertebrae. And this is the back view, so this would be the spinous process and the transverse process coming out. And then we have our superior articular facet on the top and the inferior articular facet on the bottom. So the other thing you'll have to identify is the differences in between each type of vertebrae. And if we were in lab and you could really feel them, I would give you a vertebrae and say, which is this? Is it cervical? Is it lumbar? Is it thoracic? I'll have to show you a picture here, but I'll try to give you a picture of all of them kind of related. And there's a really good video that I linked and Ed puzzled that you can look at that shows you the different vertebrae and tells you a little bit about how to tell the difference between each of them. So cervical vertebrae, the main thing to know is that they have transverse foramen in the transverse processes. And that's like the best way to figure them out. That's going to be C1 through C7. C1 and 2 look weird, and we'll get to those in a second, but they have transverse foramina. They're also the smallest, and they have kidney bean-shaped bodies, and they have bifid spinous processes, which means that it's a little bit like it's bifurcated here. And you can see this is the transverse foramen. So you can see it's small, this bean-shaped body, it has this bifurcating spinous process, and has a transverse process through here. This is the first 7. The first 2 of these are going to be special. So Atlas is C1. This supports the head. So Atlas holds up the world, right? And it articulates with those occipital condyles you had to memorize from the occipital bone. And on top, it's also going to articulate with C2, which has a dens. So it has an articular facet for the dens on the interior arch. So it looks to me like if you've ever seen like a skeleton of a whale, like it looks like a big whale mouth. Here it's going to be articulating, this is the superior articular facet that articulates with the occipital condyles. And you can see there are transverse foramen here, and it has a really wide body, but it doesn't really have the same, it has a wide vertebral foramen, but it does not have a body. So it's kind of weird looking right now, but this is going to be sitting right under the foramen magnum. Next, we have C2, which is axis, so it turns on its axis. The dens is a pivot point that the atlas is going to pivot on so that you can shake your head no. And so this here is going to be the dens. The superior articular facet is going to articulate with the inferior articular facet of C1, and then C1 kind of sits on top of it, and they pivot along each other. You can see this has a body, so it looks a little bit more like a normal cervical vertebrae. It also has the transverse foramen, and it has the bifid spinous process. And so this is how they articulate. You can have atlas sitting on top of axis, and then there is a transverse ligament that helps them rotate. So you can shake your head no. C7 is the vertebral prominence. It's a transition from the cervical to thoracic vertebrae. This spinous process is a little bit longer than other cervical vertebrae, and you can kind of palpate it in between the shoulder blades. Next, we have our thoracic vertebrae. There are 12 of them, and they're attached to the ribs. And so because they're attached to the ribs, you have these special things called costal facets or demifacets. This is where the ribs articulate, right? Remember, facet means articulation. So the head of the rib will articulate with the costal facet or demifacet. And the tubercle of the rib, and we don't need to know the different pieces of the rib, but articulates with the costal facets on the transverse processes. As we go, we can see that the body here is a little bit more heart-shaped, and it's a little bit bigger. We can see that the transverse processes have costal facets on them, so it's a little divot in the edge of the transverse process. A lot, but not all of the spinous processes are going to actually point downward. And you can see there's a little, at the bottom here is a costal demifacet. At the top you have another costal facet, and there's a costal facet on the transverse process. This is where all the ribs are attaching. And you still have the superior and inferior articular facets also. And once again, you've got your vertebral foramen here, your body, and then your lamina and your pedicle. So it still has all of the same pieces as the normal ribs. We're just kind of talking now about the differences. And there are 12 of them. So next is the lumbar vertebrae. There are 5 of this. This is the largest vertebrae. It's thicker and it's oval. And it has really giant superior and inferior articular facets. And so they are like almost as big as the transverse process. And so instead of just looking like it has the spinous process and then the 2 transverse processes, it looks like it's got these other things here. To me, it looks like antlers. And it's got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different points instead of just 3, because these articular facets are so big that they are like almost as big as the transverse processes. This is a large oval body. They're the biggest bodies. They're going to support the weight of the body. And then usually the spinous process is a little bit straighter. It doesn't like dip down as much. The sacrum is going to be important in helping form the pelvis. It's the back part of the pelvis. It articulates with the ilium at the sacroiliac joint. It has 5 fused vertebrae, and the main thing, I will maybe take some of these slides out for you guys. You don't need to know all of these. Let me see. You need to know the sacral hiatus right here, and that's it. So you don't need to worry about all the other areas. Not that they're not important, just that for this class I won't test you on them. So be able to identify the sacrum and know the sacral hiatus. It's going to be this guy down here. Now the coccyx is the tailbone. It's the fusion of 4 coccygeal vertebrae, and we can see it right here, down here. This is the coccyx and the posterior view. So now we're going to move up to the rib cage. So remember that the rib cage, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Each of them are attached to 2 ribs, a left and a right. So we have 24 ribs total. And then they're going to be attached to the sternum in the front. The sternum is going to have the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process, which is at the tip of the sternum. So you'll have to know those 3, manubrium, body, and the xiphoid process. And it's going to be attached to the ribs by these costal cartilages. So we have a couple different types of ribs. The first 7 are called true ribs, or vertebral sternal ribs. They start from the vertebrae in the back and they go all the way around to the sternum, and each of them has its own little short costal cartilage, its own driveway, to get to the sternum. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 are a type of false rib, but we call them vertebrochondral rib because it goes from the vertebrae to this cartilage. So all of these cartilages, someone once told me that the first 7 have their own driveways, and then the 8, 9, and 10 have to share a driveway. So like they connect via these cartilages that go up to that 7th rib and then eventually go up to the costal cartilage. So this is a false rib, and 8, 9, and 10 are called vertebrochondral ribs, whereas 11 and 12, they're also false ribs, but specifically we can call them floating ribs or vertebral ribs because they only connect to the vertebrae and they don't actually connect to the sternum at all. We can see a little bit about the ribs. You guys don't need to know too much about the structure of the ribs, but we can see here you've got, it's interesting to see how they connect to the vertebrae. So you've got the head connecting up here to the body of the vertebrae, and the tubercle connects up to the costal facet on the transverse process. And then it goes around. All right, so that is all for the axial skeleton, it is quite a lot. You guys make sure that you're looking at APR and you're looking at those biodigital human widgets, and you're looking at all of those videos that I linked because that will help you a lot. Let's see, was there anything else? Oh, there was one other thing I think that I wanted to mention, and it was these things. There are a couple of different tips for studying the skeleton. There's a blog called the AP Student, and this is an anatomy and physiology professor who's been teaching for a really long time, and he's got lots of good tips for studying the skeleton. And so this blog has a bunch of tips and a bunch of links for different things, but you can watch this for 10 tips for studying anatomy, specifically the skeleton. You can also look through this AP Student blog. There's a bunch of different cool study tips that you can find here. All right.